I encountered something that I can't quite explain, so bear with me, because I'm going to give you the story in full, every detail I can remember, the entire story, all the way to the very end. So, without further ado, here is my encounter. My dad retired from his job recently, but his career used to take him to all sorts of places around the globe. When I was young, I can't imagine that I was any older than 10 years old at the time. He had taken up a project which was located in Rio de Janeiro. My mom figured if my dad was going to be in Brazil for a couple of months, our family might as well reunite with him during a nice vacation there. They ultimately planned to stay at a resort in the Amazon rainforest. While we're not exceedingly rich, I'm from a pretty well-off background, so such trips were viable for my family to make. Typically, time was more of an issue than money when it came to things like that. It came time for vacation, and we reunited with my father in the resort's lobby. Since he had traveled all the way from Rio, the rest of us from Austin, our entire family was exhausted, so we didn't expect much that first night, except to get dinner. The place was pretty nice. It was widespread and airy, and had a warm breeze to it. Despite its openness, the resort was secluded by a dense array of trees, giving it a sense of privacy. After dinner, we walked back to our hut. It was pretty dark by now, but the soft lights which illuminated both the buildings nearby and the path we were traveling down made the area feel safe and cozy. We arrived at our place and winded down by watching a movie before heading off to bed. Actual activities would start the following morning. When we woke up, we got dressed and went back into the lobby, which had a large open dining room off to its side. We ordered our breakfast, and when my mom went to use the restroom, my dad snuck me and my little brother a few sips of his coffee. I think it was the first time I'd ever tried coffee before. It made my heart race beyond what felt comfortable. Our mom returned, and we had our meal, and then headed out for the day. I remember my brother and I were a bit hyper at this point, but I'm sure our mother just wrote it off as us being excited. We were slathered head to toe in sunscreen and began to head off in a hiking trail. We got about 15 minutes into it, and my parents managed to come across a couple of other adults, except they didn't have any children. They conversed together, leaving me and my brother to talk amongst ourselves. We passed a waterfall, which I'd say was about 30 feet tall, and had a cool, crystally blue color. Surrounding its pool, at the bottom, was a wooden fence about 3 feet tall, with signs all over it, warning not to swim. I pointed it out to my brother, and he asked why we couldn't swim in it, and I said I didn't know, but that I wanted to. He said he wanted to as well. We were so caught up in looking at the waterfall that we hadn't realized our parents and the other couple had trailed off so far ahead of us they were calling out for us. We called up to them, and once we finished our hike, parted ways with the other people. We then had lunch, did a few more activities such as kayaking and exploring whatever else the resort had to offer, and before we knew it, dinner had approached us. During our meal, our parents let us know that the couple they met invited them to hang out at the bar later in the night, which would leave us by ourselves. After dinner, we returned to our hut. Our parents took a little rest before leaving us with one of the key cards and relaying where the bar was located, in case we needed them, telling us to not let in any strangers, don't go wandering off, and so forth. Looking back, I think my brother and I were a bit young to be left alone by ourselves, but perhaps my parents had become accustomed to the resort at that point and figured it was pretty safe. A few minutes after our parents left, my brother and I were bored and trying to figure out what to do. We put in a movie, but it was one we had watched a million times before, so we were quickly bored. My brother brought up the waterfall that we had seen earlier in the day and that we should leave to go swimming. I mentioned that my mom and dad didn't want us to leave. He argued that they would never find out. Within an hour or so, we'd be back anyway, because they'd still be gone at the bar. I asked him what he thought about the signs on the fence that surrounded the pool. I remember him shrugging that he didn't know. I was tempted, I'm not gonna lie. We didn't have the chance to go swimming that day anyway, and I'd really wanted to. I wasn't sure if the pools were still open, but even then, just like how I'd seen the movies we brought along with us dozens of times, I'd also gone swimming in regular pools many times as well. I was craving something new and adventurous, and the resort offered the perfect opportunity. I figured it'd be really cool to tell my friends that I went swimming in a waterfall when I got back home. We finally agreed to go and changed into our swimming attire, bringing everything we needed with us, including the key card. We made our way to the area where we entered the hiking path and noticed a gate had been shut in front of it, although it was left open, allowing us to easily push through. We made our way down the path, and what I remember the most about it was it being loud as hell due to all the animals and bugs that were sighted within its vegetation. My brother and I argued a bit on where exactly the waterfall was and whether we were going in the right direction at all. But eventually, we heard the sound of it in the distance and picked up our pace. We arrived at the site, and it's surprisingly somewhat easy to see as the moonlight had reflected itself off of the water. We made our way over to the wooden fence, not even bothering to give a second glance to the warning signs it fostered, and climbed over. I put the card on top of one of the fence's poles, because I wasn't sure if it would get damaged, then wet, and feared losing it in the water. My brother put his finger into the pool and asked him whether the water was cold. He said a little bit, but still made his way in. I followed. It took a bit to get adjusted to the temperature, but before we knew it, we were swimming around and splashing. The waterfall had created a current which pushed us further down the pool, so we had to make sure to not get too far away. But even then, it wasn't terribly strong. We played at the waterfall, pretended to shower ourselves with it, along with swimming behind it. I heard some odd noises in the distance, and I paused and shushed my brother. I told him to listen in. They happened again. This time, I could make out the sounds more clearly. It sounded like heavy footsteps and the squawking of a bird, and it lightly echoed across the sky. As time went on, it only seemed to get closer. At first, I was paranoid that our parents were looking for us, but I soon realized there was no way that it was a human being. My brother and I anxiously whispered to each other, trying to figure out what it was, but to no avail. Soon, a creature revealed itself in the distance, and in the dim light, I can make out a vaguely human shape. My brother asked if it was some sort of ape or monkey, and I told him I didn't know. As it moved around, it only looked more bizarre. I remember odd spiked shapes poking out of its body, and it had a long tail, which seemed to whip around behind it. It got even closer, and was easier to make out by now. The first thing I noticed was that its eyes reflected a yellowish-greenish tint in the light, and then I could make out that its body was covered in a brown-green scales, with talons at the end of each limb. It leapt across the surrounding area of the pool, and when it rested, it crouched much like a human would. It couldn't seem to decide whether it wanted to move on 2 legs or 4. Then, my eyes met its own. It let out the familiar bird squawking and dove into the water, swimming in a doggy paddle fashion towards me and my brother. We screamed, moving as fast as we could, and I didn't dare look back as we heard this thing splashing behind us. We finally got to the edge of the pool, and as I went to pull my body up, I felt one of its talons slice my ankle in an attempt to grab it. I screamed once more, and not knowing what else to do, took a shot in the dark by taking my other foot and kicking this thing in the face. It let out a hissing noise, and my brother and I clambered over the fence and ran into the forest, our arms and leg getting snugged on all kinds of plants. We eventually got our way back onto the path, but we weren't entirely sure which direction to head. Ultimately, we just took a guess. I wasn't even sure if that thing or monster was still following us, but we could still hear the noises it was making in the distance, which was enough to keep us from running for our lives. We ended up back at the gate from which we entered and ran out screaming, crying. A couple of women passing nearby stopped us to ask us what was wrong, and we told them something tried to kill us, and they asked where our parents were. It took me a moment to recollect, but I told them they said they were at the bar. They took us back to the bar, asking for our parents' names so they could call them out. After a few minutes, they came to us. We told them what we had told the women. My parents were a bit upset and pretty irritated that we left when we were told not to. But long story short, we finally got into some dry clothes and into bed, and I managed to get my wound cleaned out. Luckily, it wasn't too severe. As the women reported the incident to the resort, the next morning, the path was closed off for the day, so the staff could try and find out what we were talking about, but they told my parents they hadn't come across anything. The rest of our vacation went as normal, but regardless, it was most certainly difficult to enjoy myself after that experience, and to this day, I'm still very hesitant to go back. So, there's my story. Take it for what you will, believe it if you want, but I still think about this encounter from day to day, and it still bothers me. I don't know what kind of creatures live in the Amazon forest, but I have never heard of a creature like that, and I certainly hope we don't have creatures like that living up here in the States.